two Ford Rangers in sport trim, but with a massive heart transplant between them. In the red, the Ranger Hybrid. In the silver, the Ranger V6 diesel. But should anybody be buying the hybrid Ranger over a diesel engine version of Australia's best-selling vehicle? I will reveal the answer in today's video. Before we get started, hit subscribe below.
Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by
Budget Direct.
So what are we going to do together to get to the bottom of this comparison? Well, we've got 5 things to do in this video. First, we're going to take the Ranger Hybrid for an urban range test. I've topped it up on the chargers here at the Chasing Cars office. We'll see exactly how far the 11.8 kilowatt hour usable battery can take us. The WLTP claim is 43 Ks. Let's see what we get in the real world. Second thing we're going to do is on a dead battery in the hybrid, we're going to take these two Rangers out for a big 500 kilometer loop to see how much fuel they actually use in the real world. I'm talking a bit of urban, highway, country, real driving, not just driving for economy. And the results might surprise you. Thirdly, I'll tell you how these vehicles drive differently, because although they look the same, the experience behind the wheel is quite different. And it's not just about engine, it's also about suspension. Fourth, I'll show you some weird quirks of the interiors of these cars and how the South African built Ranger Hybrid actually gets a bit more stuff than the Thai built diesel Ranger. And fifth, I'll let you know what I think Ford has to do in order to improve the Ranger Hybrid in future to appeal to more buyers. Each year, tens of thousands of Australians are choosing to buy a Ford Ranger over something like a Hilux or a Mitsubishi Triton. And they're doing it for several reasons, one of which is the presence of a diesel V6 engine. Now, the diesel V6 Ranger is expensive, not as expensive as the hybrid, as we're about to see, but its 3-litre Lion V6 is a big draw card. Now, this engine's had a few problems in the past, it's had revisions over time, but there's no arguing with the 184 kilowatts and 600 newton meters running through this big diesel donk, and it does make the Ranger good to drive. But it's got a big problem. It is dirty in terms of CO2 output. Now, you might not care about that, but the federal government definitely does. And on the 1st of July 2025, financial consequences began to stack up for car makers that sell too many high CO2 vehicles like this diesel Ranger and not enough EVs and hybrids. Now, who would be exposed to a policy like that? Ford, because they sell barely any Mustang Mach-E's here in Australia, and they sell an awful lot of diesel and petrol Rangers and Everests. So here's the cheat code. This is the Ranger plug-in hybrid. Now, the regulators assume that with plug-in hybrids, you charge them. Will customers actually charge them? That doesn't matter according to the law. The Ranger Hybrid produces 66 grams per kilometre on paper. That is way below the limit, which is 180 grams per kilometre next year for utes and just 110 grams per kilometre in 2029. So with this at 66, Ford can sell as many Ranger Hybrids as it can, and it will want to massively sell these vehicles here in Australia. That's why you should care about this video. The Ranger Hybrid is going to become a very common sight on Australian roads. So is it any good? Well, that's what we're going to be looking into in today's video. We'll get into the specifics of the engine, how it trails some of its Chinese rivals on specs, but also some of the things this South African Ranger Hybrid gets right, including the way it drives, which is pretty decent.
At its current price, the Ranger Hybrid only makes sense if you do a large percentage of your driving in urban areas and you will actually charge this battery regularly for this urban driving. But how far can the plug-in hybrid go on battery power alone? We set off on a fair and thorough range test during peak hour in Sydney with some stop-and-go traffic, flowing suburban roads, and a bit of urban expressway at 60 to 80 k's an hour. Ford claims 43 kilometres WLTP on electric, but we managed 47 kilometres before the engine forced itself on, meaning consumption of 25.1 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres. Frankly, that's decent for a big, heavy, and not very aerodynamic hybrid, and is far cheaper than running a Ranger for 47 Ks on liquid fuel. But it all comes down to whether you'll charge it, because on a dead battery, the Ranger Hybrid uses about 8 litres per 100 Ks of petrol in town. We then did the same urban loop in the Ranger V6 and it drank 11.5 litres per 100 Ks of diesel. Speaking of, that was the next component of our range and consumption testing. What about when you need to go further than 47 kilometres? We grabbed both ranges and embarked on about a 500 kilometre loop out of the office, which included both highways and high-speed country roads. We ran the hybrid on an exhausted battery to simulate weekend road trips. How did the pair fare? The diesel V6 used 8.4 litres per 100 k's of diesel in this environment, while the plug-in hybrid petrol used 8.6 litres per 100 k's. Not a terrible blowout in the scheme of things, but important to note. So, who will save money with a Ranger hybrid? A buyer who does, say, at least half of their driving in urban areas and will charge the battery. In all other use cases, you're better off with the 4-cylinder diesel, while the thirsty V6 diesel or even the petrol V6 Raptor are the indulgent choices. Of course, if Ford lowered the price of the hybrid, these sorts of calculations would need to be done again. With our range and fuel consumption testing out of the way, it's time to reveal some interesting differences in the way these utes drive.
Now, I think it is important to talk about how the Ford Ranger drives in both hybrid and non-hybrid versions, because the driving dynamics are actually one of the key reasons why you'd choose a Ranger over one of the newer plug-in hybrid utes like the Shark 6 or the GWM Cannon Alpha PHEV, both of which are much cheaper, much better value, have more electric range, more combined power, the sorts of stats that look really good on paper. And neither of them are terrible to drive. It's just that the Ford Ranger is better on road. So if you're doing a lot of touring, if you're spending a lot of time in the vehicle, it can still pay off to go with a Ranger even at a slightly inflated price, although perhaps not quite what Ford is trying to charge for the PHEV. But I'm currently in the V6 because I want to start by telling you what these vehicles have in common, and that is well-adjusted ride and handling. You can really tell that Ford appointed the people that stuck around in its engineering team from the Falcon and the Territory teams back in the day onto the Ranger and Everest project, because this vehicle does genuinely feel well attuned to all the different sorts of roads that we get here in Australia, and that tuning has also made the Ranger good to drive in America and Europe and the other markets in which it's sold. But really, its ride and handling is the standout for the Ford Ranger, and none of the other mid-size pickups on the market have been able to catch it until possibly the new Kia Tasman. And I've reviewed it and I was impressed with the ride and handling. What I mean by polished ride and handling in a segment like this is not that the Ranger drives like an SUV or like a car, but among utes, it has an excellent balance of ride comfort and polished handling, mostly on-road, although its off-roading ability is also quite good. In the ride quality front, it is simply more compliant and controlled and comfortable than nearly all of its rivals. Maybe not the Tasman, but it's right up there. And in terms of the handling, it has a consistency and a safe feeling sure-footedness that most utes simply lack. You can basically get into any ute on sale in Australia and work out how to drive it quite quickly and drive it just fine. But in the Ranger, you're elevated into a spot somewhere between utes and SUVs where you feel confident to drive it a little bit faster, a little bit harder, and you can even find a little bit of enjoyment in the Ranger on a country road. Those virtues are shared no matter the powertrain in the Ranger lineup. However, some vices are also shared, including steering, which isn't perfect. It's a little bit loose and slow in the ratio for my tastes. Most utes are like that, but I would like to see the Ranger pick up slightly quicker steering in future. Now, the V6 diesel was of course the halo powertrain, other than the Raptor, when the T6.2 Ranger launched. It's the Lion engine, 184 kilowatts of power, 600 Newton meters of torque, and it feels muscular and pretty effortless all the time. And it also sounds pretty good for a diesel. There's pronounced turbo whistle, but the engine itself is hushed and bassy, and it sounds a lot better than a 4-cylinder diesel. It's quite refined. However, it's not overwhelmingly quick, and there's a little bit of lag in gear in the Ranger V6, and that's one of the reasons why it's actually slower than the plug-in hybrid on a dead battery. We got 8.7 seconds from 0 to 100 in the V6 diesel in sport trim, although we are on all-terrain tyres here, which doesn't help with those acceleration runs. However, the engine's a good one. You're able to deploy the power consistently. It's very well paired to the 10-speed automatic, and it's a nice upgrade over the 2-litre bi-turbo 4-cylinder diesel, even though the 4-pot will actually suit most people most of the time. The V6 is one of those indulgences that you might splash for if you really just want all of that power more of the time. But at the right price, could the plug-in hybrid actually be a superior powertrain, and a superior drive in other ways. Let's find out. Okay, moving across to the Ranger plug-in hybrid, or Ranger Hybrid as the marketing appears to be positioning it as here in Australia, which in some ways is smart because apart from those aero wheels and the fact that it tends to take off in EV mode with any kind of charge in the battery, it's difficult to tell from behind the wheel that you're not in a diesel Ranger. The absence of diesel clatter is one other way because there's pretty good refinement to the pairing of the turbo petrol and the electric motor in the Ranger Hybrid. Now, yes, it is detuned compared to the Volkswagen Amarok TSI or a Ford Mustang EcoBoost, but the retuning or detuning makes it more like a diesel. Relatively low engine power, relatively high engine torque, which means it does most of its work in the low RPMs, much like a diesel, although without their clattery noise. But like most plug-in hybrids, there's always some element of electric juice kept in the battery, and the Ranger also regens a fair bit of power under the brakes while coasting. And so as you squirt out of corners like this, or you go to overtake or merge, you are feeling more than just the engine's outputs. You are getting some electric assistance much of the time, and it's punchy and quicker than the V6 diesel. We managed 8.6 seconds 0 to 100 in the hybrid compared to 8.7 for the V6, so they're close. But with any kind of charge in the battery, this plug-in hybrid is going to get up and go faster than the V6, let alone the 4-cylinder diesel. Still some way off a Raptor, but even for that Raptor, Ford is now looking at a plug-in hybrid solution because its CO2 emissions are way higher than what's going to be allowed here in Australia in the coming years. And Ford just doesn't want to pay the penalties, and it can't increase prices fast enough to cover the cost of the penalties. It'd make a Raptor way into six figures if they did that. So they need a new solution. And Ford is looking at a plug-in hybrid for the Raptor. So the fact that they've started pretty conservatively on this relatively low output, sort of fuel efficient version of the hybrid system is okay because frankly, it's smooth, it's intuitive, it's very normal to drive with really no quirks to the powertrain at all. And then there's the ride and handling, which is still good, as we know from the rest of the lineup, but actually the suspension has been stiffened a little. But that hasn't ruined it. If anything, it's actually slightly improved it for me because I find the diesels are a little bit too soft and cushy in the Ranger for my liking. The maybe 10-15% stiffer hybrid has gotten it to a point with really nice body control, still a nice level ride. I quite like the ride quality in the Ranger Hybrid. Steering still a little bit too slow in the rack for me, wish that was a bit quicker because the chassis is competent. It's there with you, and like the diesels, like the Raptor, the Ranger Hybrid is surprisingly rewarding to drive for a ute. If you like driving, if you care about driving dynamics and you need a ute, you'll probably want a Ranger or an Amarok. We know the Tasman's getting close now, but the Kia certainly doesn't have any modern powertrain tech like this. And compared to the Chinese plug-in hybrids, well, the Ranger is slower, it's got a lot less power, it's got less electric range, and all of those things do make a difference. But it doesn't feel kind of crappy or lethargic out on the road. It actually feels quite slick and a lot like a 4-cylinder or a V6 diesel to drive, which I suspect was pretty much the point when Ford was tuning this vehicle. I also think it's fascinating to see that the likes of GWM are hiring Australian chassis gurus to make their vehicles drive better. In that sense, the Ranger T6.2 was more correct out of the box, and that's why it feels at home on these roads, even in new hybrid form.
While you do lose a little bit of payload in the Ranger Hybrid compared to the diesel versions, particularly if you option the no-cost option of a full-size spare in the hybrid, you do pick up one very cool feature. It's not a damp tailgate, which Rangers don't have, but it is this panel in here, which is what Ford calls Pro Power Onboard. That's really just a fancy marketing term for some pretty well-executed vehicle-to-load functionality. So we've got up to 6.9 kilowatts of concurrent electrical output from the Ranger Hybrid. So it's basically like driving around with a huge battery. And if the vehicle runs out of battery, well, it just starts its petrol engine to keep that electricity flowing. So you can pull up on the work site, or if you're me, I think it might be obvious I don't work on a work site, but you maybe have a blackout at home, or you're doing a video for chasing cars out on a remote location, you have enormous ability to charge and keep appliances powered here. So we've got two 15 amp outlets here in the tray. Each of those can put out about 3.5 kilowatts apiece, and there's a further 2.5 kilowatt hour outlet in the cabin. And all of it is actually managed quite nicely through the touchscreen, which shows you what's plugged in to what ports and what the concurrent output of the vehicle is at that point in time. It's pretty nice execution. These two Rangers both appear in sport trim, which is sort of a mid to high specification here in Australia. And initially they look precisely familiar. We all know the Ford Ranger interior. It's got reasonably comfortable seats, decent ergonomics with things like clear knobs and dials for volume and climate, although below the belt line, the quality does definitely slip. Still, among utes, this is one of the better interiors, though not as fancy as the Chinese plug-in hybrid utes like the Canon Alpha Phev or the BYD Shark 6, which have more of a veneer of luxury, but the Ranger is decent enough. However, there are some odd quirks that separate the South African hybrid from the Thai diesel. Firstly, the steering wheel leather, really different, very smooth on the hybrid, quite coarse on the diesel. Does that matter? No, but it's interesting all the same to me. Bigger touchscreen on the plug-in hybrid Sport. This is the 12-inch version here instead of the 10 that you get in the other car. You lose height adjustment on the passenger seat in the hybrid, which is a bit unusual, but the hybrid gets, in sport trim, the pop-out cup holders that are missing from the diesel. So we've got a few questions to answer before we can wrap up this video. One, should anyone buy a Ranger hybrid right now? Well, sure. If you're ready to lean into a hybrid ute, you have a plan to charge this vehicle in order to realize the running cost benefits, and you do a lot of Ks behind the wheel, meaning you'll actually enjoy the Ranger's really well sorted ride and handling. You may prefer the Ford to the BYD Shark 6 or the GWM Canon Alpha PHEV. It at least deserves to be in the mix because the driving dynamics of this vehicle are well sorted. However, the big problem is the price. Frankly, the diesel V6 Ranger is already pretty expensive and an opulent purchase if you're interested in a dual cab. The fact that the PHEV is another $4,400 more expensive means it is priced into the stratosphere. It's left those Chinese rivals way behind. It's far more expensive and it's far too expensive. And I think we will see Ford discount the Ranger hybrid. Because remember what I said at the start of the video? Ford has got to sell these things. It's got to comply with the emissions regime or the penalties will be absolutely debilitating. They would have to jack up the price of every Ranger by an enormous amount in order to cover the penalties. They're just not going to do that. What Ford is going to do is try and sell as many Super Duties as it can, which are currently exempt from NVES. We'll see if the government closes that loophole in time. And it's going to try and sell as many Ranger hybrids as it can. To me, this vehicle should be no more expensive than the diesel V6. If they were the same price, more people would consider the Ranger hybrid because of the Pro Power on board, really nice feature, all electric running for 47 Ks as I found out, really nice if you can charge the vehicle, really reduces your running costs. But I don't think Ford should stop there on adjusting the price. The other thing it should do is make the battery a little bit bigger. It doesn't need to become that much bigger because the compromise to payload would be annoying to a lot of users. So maybe 20 or 30% bigger. I think they should consider making it LFP chemistry so you can charge it to 100% reliably all of the time. But the main change I want to see Ford make is I think they need to increase the power of the electric motor, which would mean that the Ranger hybrid would use its electric motor more of the time, meaning it would have to fire up its petrol engine less of the time, and you'd realize even more running cost benefits, and it would feel smoother, slicker, and even quicker to drive. Frankly, this ain't a bad version 1 product, particularly because the ride and handling are correct, the interior is easy to live with, feels like a normal Ranger. A little bit of adjustment and a little bit of more effort on the tech side, and a more realistic price will make the Ranger plug-in hybrid actually quite a compelling vehicle. So let's see what Ford does. You can let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. While you're there, hit subscribe and the notification bell if you want to see more content like this. And as always, thank you for watching Chasing Cars.